Well, welcome to Unleash the Beast, yet another podcast where we are going to be discussing today the impact on mental health of gambling and gambling addiction. Now, before I introduce to you our panel here today, I just want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that we're recording this podcast and those of the lands where this podcast is being heard. We pay our respects to the elders past, present and emerging, and we thank them very much for their care of the land. Our guests today, joining me, I have to my left the Commissioner of Liquor and Gambling from the Queensland Government. Would you please welcome Victoria Thompson? Also to my right, and a very dear friend of mine who we've known for many, many years and is not only the head of Lifeline here in our region, but is also the chair of the Responsible Gambling Advisory Committee for Queensland, Derek Tuffield.
Thank you, Lee.
Hey, mate. And we welcome David McAnallen.
Very well done.
There we go. I was listening. Who is a gambling help educator from Relationships Australia, that also has first-hand experience of what we're talking about today, gambling addiction, and 21 years clean from gambling.
Yes, all forms. Thank you, Lee.
Absolutely fantastic. Congratulations to you. Let's kick this off then with how gambling becomes a problem in the first place. And I guess it is appropriate, David, to start with you, because 21 years ago, you were in the grip of a gambling addiction and you're trying to change your life. Take us back to prior to that, where it begins.
So where it begins, I had a lot of problems going on before my exposure to gambling. And my family are really social gamblers, but their gambling was more fascinating to me than it was to them. And it did something for me that nothing else did, and it took away the ill-at-ease feeling. I always often say I was a square peg trying to fit into a round hole. I never felt right from a very young age. And what gambling did for me, it took away that ill-at-ease feeling and allowed me to feel like I had no problems at all in the world. And so what I now know was I was always going to be into the gambling for the effect, what gambling does for me. And not what gambling does to me, but what gambling does for me. Mm-hmm. And so gambling ultimately started out initially as a solution for me in my life. I had a lot of problems underneath that. Mm-hmm. And then with that exposure to gambling, and I still remember it, I still remember going to that school fete and my mum and dad giving me that lecture that parents do with pocket money. You've only got so much money. Don't spend it all at once. I got to the lucky boys dip and the lucky girls dip, and they said it's 20 cents a go, and I opened up my wallet, and they said there's one big prize in the boys, and I didn't get it the first go. So I had another go, another go, another go. When I emptied my pocket money, I looked, and there was my mum away from my dad. So I went over and I said, I'm out of money already. Got chided, but was given some money, and then I spotted Dad away over there, and I went over and did the same thing. So my first set of lies started around my gambling at that stage, and it just progressed. It progressed. My gambling solution came for all my challenges that I was facing in my life.
Derek, does that ring true to what you've heard many, many times before as you have reached out a helping hand to those that have been in the same situation as David, that it begins perhaps with the family, but certainly begins with something else that is happening in their life that draws them into this?
Oh, definitely, Lee. It's I guess for everyone it's different, and but often there are underlying issues that actually find that gambling, as David said, creates a space for them where they feel that they're safe to some degree and they're accepted, and they can forget about what's happening in the wider world for them, and I guess before they know it, what will also I find sometimes will trigger it is that they will have a win up front, quite a good win, and then all of a sudden they go, oh, that was easy, I should be able to replicate that, and they will start to chase getting that feeling. That win again. But I do want to also acknowledge what David was saying. I was doing some work with Alcoholics Anonymous the other day, and I asked them a question about now that there's non-alcoholic beer, zero beer, can you have a beer? And what they said to me was, well, we don't drink for the taste, Derek, we drink for the effect. And that's exactly what David said. The gambling becomes what's the effect.
And then the thrill, I'm assuming, of the win then catapults that feeling and then encourages the next, and then the next, that thrill of opening perhaps that big prize or whatever it may be, that then perpetuates.
Lee, look, I've heard too many times exactly what Derek said. That their initial bet has been a win.
Yes.
And it's changed the dynamic because they've got there's underlying stuff going for them. But there's no thrill when you're gambling for a person who has a very poor relationship to gambling. And I'm going to use that phrase a lot today, relationship to gambling, as opposed to problem gambling. My thrill comes from actually driving, anticipating, coming to go and do my gambling. I don't actually have much emotion when I'm gambling. So I can be gambling and have a win and it won't change my demeanour at all. It won't do it. In fact, I'm very much just in a zone. Your social gamblers are the ones who go, yahoo, and carry on, but it's the person a couple of seats down or over at a different table in the bingo hall or at the raffle and so on who's just, just like me, just going, yeah, so what?
Yeah. Rebecca, you want to weigh in on that?
Victoria,
you want to weigh in on that? My apologies.
And I think what we've heard so far, in terms of David's story and the stories that Derek's related about individuals and, their very early exposure to gambling. One of the things that I think we also need to talk about in terms of how gambling becomes a problem is the environmental factors.
Yes.
And, what people are surrounded by, what they're exposed to. Just talking about poker machines, that sort of nature of them, the constancy, the features, the designs. When people are playing those machines, that's what we hear is what was just said by David was around that getting in the zone. So, it's not the peaks and troughs, it's just being in front of the machine and just constantly playing. And so that is part of it. It's the biological, it's the genetic, it's the environmental. It's not just about individuals. It's all of those things, and you can't probably extract one from the other. And I think, how gambling becomes a problem for people is also going to really evolve over the next wee while as we see changes in gambling products as well. We see, the rise of online betting and online wagering, and the environment in which that gambling occurs is shifting and changing. So I think, as a regulator, that's something that we're very interested in, because what we're about is knowing, and this is why government has laws, is it is a harmful product for some people. And so how do we intervene in the best possible way to make sure those controls are in place?
And Victoria, that was my next point, is just that fine line that you're treading between stepping on fair trade and the ability for those poker machine companies to do what they do to attract their customer, but at the same time keep in mind the health of the people of Australia.
Yeah, that's right. And as a regulator, we do have that balancing role. And we know that for the vast majority of people who go down their local club on a Friday night or pop into the TAB on a Saturday to put a bet, it's recreation and it's fun. Yeah. It's something that they like to do to, spend some time with their friends or their spouse and have a good night out. But there are, a minority of people for which gambling then, ruins their life. And it's not just about the gambler. It's also about the people around them, their families, their friends, that ripple effect. I was talking with somebody who, like David, has not gambled for many years, but, what they talked about to me was, that complete dissociation from families, from friends, and not listening to anybody when they were in the midst of their addiction. But so for us as the regulator, we want to work with industry, we want to work with community groups, we want to work with Derek through his involvement in the RGAC and make sure that, we've got the balance right. And that is incredibly difficult to make sure that we're not over-regulating, but at the same time not underplaying that it's not just 0.51% of the population who are problem gamblers. We have a whole ripple effect out from those people to their families, their friends, their employers, and also people who have a moderate risk of gambling harm as well, and intervening early and making sure that they don't progress to the next level. So it is difficult. It's a balancing act.
Very much so. And then obviously part of what we're talking about here today is the impact that this behaviour then has on mental health. And of course, Derek, you would be at the forefront of seeing the fallout of that as well.
Well, the gambling help services throughout the state are the first point of contact in many cases, or the gambling helpline, which is 1800 858 858, is available 24 hours a day. But it's interesting, the mental health impact often is on the family first rather than the individual, because the family member knows something's going wrong. The money's not in the bank account. The bills aren't getting paid on time. They're not turning up for work when they need to be turning up for work. They seem to be absent when people don't know why they're absent. So it's often, I find often that the family will pick up on it first, and then they will raise the issue with the person who's affected by it. And initially there's a bit of denial there that will start, well, no, everything's fine. But that ripple effect then, as also Victoria spoke about, happens that not only is the family affected, the person themselves, but then their employees, their friends, it ripples outwards. And so getting them back to ground zero, to away, is when often we'll see family members who will bring their loved one in and say, can we talk about what's going on for us? And we see a lot of that happen.
It's almost a chicken and egg scenario. What comes first? Is it the mental health issue that has sent the person into that gambling spiral, or is it the gambling spiral that has caused the mental health issue?
It's a great question. My lived experience tells me it is the mental health. And I've heard it too many times where the conditions had been well and truly set for the action of gambling to come into play and take over. And that's why I say it's a gambling solution. So I can categorise myself in three simple ways. In fact, I can categorise most addicts in three simple ways. They're super sensitive, they're childlike, and they have no boundaries. And I was full of fear as a kid. In fact, all my earliest memories are all fear-based. And, and because of that, I was always making all my decisions based on my fears. And so when gambling came along in my life, and we're talking a young age here, I would sit on my granddad's knee, and my granddad would have 2 bets on a Saturday, but he would listen to all the scratchings. But I would be fascinated by it. My mum and dad would go and visit some friends to play cards, and Dad, can I put your copper coins out? Dad, can I pick a number in the pools? Dad, can I do this? Because it was doing more for me. And so the conditions are there, and so much what we see with a gambler is just a tip of the iceberg. And when I'm out educating, I say to industry and community, tell me what problem gambling looks like, and they all tell me the same things. And then I go, I'm going to tell you that's the gambling solution. So what do you think the real problem is? And then they usually can only pick 1 or 2 of the many things that are the underlying stuff. And when we talk about the families and friends and businesses, if they have a gambler in their lives, it's not a spectator sport for them. They get to play and play badly. It was only recently my mother said to me, it's taken many years, but you're finally growing into the man I hoped you would be.
And it's something that I can relate to. Part of the reason that Matt has asked me to be a part of this discussion and others surrounding particularly mental health is that I've been very open on my radio show, as Derek knows, about my own journey with mental health. And I felt the hairs on my arm stand up when you talked about your story there, and about how when you were young and impressionable, that your memories are full of fear. And I had a very similar upbringing, had a very similar scenario, and it's only been in the last decade that I've sought the appropriate help. But prior to that, I was self-medicating with drugs and alcohol as opposed to gambling. So it's a very similar scenario, and not one that is pleasant for anybody involved, whether it be my family members or employees or whoever it may have been. So, but again, what was a drinking problem? What's a drug problem? Well, it's about how wasted you are or whatever, but it has nothing to do with that. It's about what led you to that point. And it is obviously a very important thing to take it right back to that before you start trying to heal the gambling problem. It's the other problems that need to be sorted out first.
Absolutely, Lee. And, we're talking about symptoms. Gambling is a symptom of a much wider problem, just like alcohol, just like drugs. The slight challenge with gambling is, though, with alcohol, a person who has a poor relationship with alcohol, they need alcohol. A poor relationship with either licit or illicit drugs, you need those things. To have a poor relationship with gambling, you've got to have cash.
Yes.
You've got to have money. And so that's where the great challenge is, and that's where, in dealing with gamblers, there's, they can be lying in the gutter, but they'll still look down on everyone else.
Victoria, I see you nodding along there. Did you want to add something?
Oh, I mean, just the complexity of the mental health and the gambling relationship, and what, as you say, what comes first, the chicken or the egg? I mean, we know when people have poor mental health, it disrupts cognitive decision making. People lose their impulse control. They isolate themselves from perhaps people who could support and help them. So, all of these things are really complex, and hence why, our gambling help services, which I know we'll probably talk a lot more about later, it's not just a conversation about stopping gambling. It's a far more looking at various aspects of people's lives and seeing how they're travelling in different ways. And just as a little by the by to maybe, again, underline what David says, the relationship between these, 42% of clients who've used our gambling help services in Queensland have experienced mental health issues, and 38% report that they're having issues with drug and alcohol dependence. So again, these things, I think the technical word, Lee, is comorbidities, how these symptoms, as David says, they all kind of coalesce together, and it's really hard to kind of unpick them. And I think the other one that really stood out for us, particularly as we were coming out of COVID, I don't know if you knew, but, as we reopened the pubs and clubs after a 3-month hiatus, which was really great for some people because it took them away from, their ability to gamble, we saw a 40% increase in EGM expenditure here in Queensland. And so I think there's some real questions to ask in terms of, people's anxieties, their loneliness, their depression, and how they're coping, and what sort of relationship that has with their gambling behaviour as well.
Okay. Why does it seem to be, and is there an answer to the fact that they're similar to when we talk about mental health and we talk about young men in particular that seem to be vulnerable and perhaps not willing to speak up? Why, again, are we talking that young men, 18 to 34, seem to be of the highest risk factor of having a gambling addiction?
It's a good question. I guess for our young people at the moment, and I guess I think Victoria spoke about outside influences earlier. In our media sometimes, we're promoting that getting together and gambling in numbers is a great thing to do. It's about being pals and mates and that. Let's gamble as a group. I'm not supportive of that. I think that's actually not the right way to go. And so young people also have disposable income more at those early years, Lee, so they've got that bit of extra cash to go about. I'm not sure of the actual research that says at the moment why it's that particular cohort of young people, but at the same time, it's also been a cohort of young people that are at most risk of self-harm over the years too, so that when things are going bad, their mental health's not well, self-harm has raised to the forefront. So it's certainly more work for us to do within the RGAC as part of a lot of research that's happening not only in Queensland but around Australia at the moment. But I can't here at this podcast put a finger on one direct reason why. I think it's a multiple reasons. David and Victoria may have different concepts of it.
Yeah, look, for me, we understand now with addiction it's disconnect.
Yeah.
And our modern society is disconnecting us more than ever. And the greatest group that is being disconnected are our young people. And, one of the wonderful things that happened for me when I got stable and restarted life, I studied and became a teacher. And I watched self-esteem lessen as the years went on, resilience lessen, and, the fascination with I had to get my self-esteem by how many chats I was getting on my Snapchat, how many likes I was getting on my Instagram and so forth. And so our modern world is preparing us for greater disconnect, and it is our young people that are having that greater disconnect. And I think for young men, and I've got nothing more than my own gut experience to this, is with the advent of Me Too, and rightfully so too, because that's been horrible what's happened, but young men don't know where they fit in this picture anymore. Young men don't know where they sit, and so they're a bit lost, they're a bit disconnected, and if the seeds and the conditions are right, then that exposure then becomes the avenue. See, gambling did for me what nothing else did. All my problems, I don't have to think about anything when I'm in a zone.
Yeah.
In fact, Derek talked about talking with people who suffer from alcoholism. Alcoholics have blackouts, gamblers have them too.
Does it make it in you? Because David, touching on the advent of online, and this must have brought about a whole another set of scenario for the regulators. Because previously, if you go back only 3 decades, if you weren't in the middle of a city or somewhere near somewhere where people could gamble, you probably had less propensity. So if you're in regional areas and you may be on farms and so forth, now all of a sudden they only have to open up their phone.
Absolutely.
And there's advertising coming up for gambling and so forth. So we bring a whole another group of people that are even further disconnected from friends and family perhaps into this scenario as well. The regulator now has to come in on that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's what I was talking about before, these environmental factors and, the accessibility of gambling products, as you say, people just on their phone and away they go. And so there is some work that is happening across government levels to try and, number one, better understand it. These products are relatively new, so we need to understand how people interact with them and how you can actually use that technology for good as well. So one of the things that I think we're quite excited about as a regulator is the discussions that we have had with industry about how do you actually design into the technology controls, because people are fallible, right? You deal with individuals and their behaviours, and when they're in the depths of addiction, they're not predictable, their cognitive decision making is impaired. But if you can build safeguards into technology, then that's a fantastic thing. And so we want to use the technology for the purposes of good and to, make sure that things like activity statements or pre-commitment or pop-up messages when people have been gambling for excessive periods of hours, they're things that are available. But just talking about young men, and whilst that's right, they're definitely an at-risk group, I think the thing to press is it doesn't discriminate though. It really, people think that this might be something that happens to young men or happens to people from certain walks of life. It's right across the board. There are definitely some risk characteristics. When I, as the regulator, get applications for, say, clubs with EGMs to be built in a certain area, one of the things we'll look at is the social indicators within that area. We're very interested in employment rates, we're very interested in educational attainment, we're very interested in support services within that community. So, we've got cold communities, so culturally and linguistically diverse communities as well. We know, for instance, that they don't participate in gambling as much as other community types, but when they do, they tend to lose more. So, it's important that we look at different populations, that we don't treat everybody as a homogenous mass, that we understand them, we understand the way that they engage with the product, and that as regulators working with industry, working with community, that we put the controls in place that make sense for the problem that we're facing.
I mentioned my own mental health issues, and I mentioned, drug and alcohol. And for me, like anybody that's been down that road, it is a never-ending road from here on in. It's not a. I've now got a tick from my psychologist to say, well, you're cured and you'll never have to worry again. It's every single day that I deal with that. Is that the same for a gambler?
Yes. I have to stay vigilant. For me, I know there are things that I have to do in my daily life that gives me really good immunity, and I say really good immunity, not total immunity, because I've been around this long enough to see what happened to those who didn't stay around long enough doing the things they need to do on a daily basis, and they come back more broken than before. Or sadly, I've been to their funerals.
Yes.
Or gone to visit them in prison, and I've also gone to the psych wards, and the dynamic can change. I only met a guy the other day who had only been gambling 6 weeks, and he was insane, and it was about cryptocurrency, and he was just insane when I was talking to him, and I said, "Listen, I need to stop talking." He said, "Why?" I said, "You've come here seeking help, but you've still got all the answers. So when you're ready to ask me a question, I'll be over there having a coffee." And he said, "Oh, okay, I'll shut up." And I said, "That's probably a good thing." But I've never seen such insanity in a 6-week period. He'd sold a car, all the cash out of his business, deferred taxes, had done this, and this. And he was telling me, all I got to do is find the right crypto. If I can find the right crypto, I'll change my life.
Absolutely. And again, I can certainly relate to that. I think my first 3 sessions were me telling my psychologist how everybody else was doing all of these things wrong that were forcing me into my behaviours. And finally, I looked in the mirror. So I can relate to that once again. This is where organisations like Lifeline come in. You're there to try to pick up the pieces. I would imagine, Derek, and we've had this conversation before, the hardest part is getting them to reach out in the first place.
Yeah, getting people to seek help is always a challenge, and whether that's gambling or even in emergency relief, to ask for help's a big step. Having someone to help them do that, and I think Lifeline has in the Darling Downs, we're one of the gambling help services throughout the state, and there's a number of services with different organisations. So I want to acknowledge that too. Our coverage area is quite large because we actually cover the southwest here as well. And, don't be afraid. If you know someone who's struggling with their gambling at the moment and you're listening to this podcast, get them to go with you, make contact, pick up the phone, start the dialogue, get things happening to get a session with us. We can help out with financial counselling. We can help out with personal counselling, strategies to try and get their addiction under control, support for the family and their loved ones around them, which is really important, because when someone is heading towards what I call bedrock, when they're really going down and they're reaching out, they're trying to get cash wherever they can, and they get quite creative. I remember one fellow I was working with said it wasn't until I had my parents' washing machine strapped on my back and I carried it up to the pawn shop to pawn it and I realised it was closed that I realised I actually had a problem here because he was going to cash it in. Is that help is available, and as I said earlier, whether the helpline through the Gambling Help Services, also there's gambling help online as well. We're making it as easy to access as possible, but taking that first step is quite a challenge. Once they've done it, often we'll find they will come back again and they'll have a second session because they're getting something out of it. And it is, we don't say that we can cure them. I don't think, Gambling Help Services aren't about curing it. It's about returning normality back to your life as much as you can and getting it to a point where they're going, I believe I've got my gambling under control. Now, the next step, as Dave has spoken about, is you can go, no, I'm giving up, I'm going to go to GA. And people will go to Gamblers Anonymous and give up altogether. They do relapse sometimes, it's just a fact. But if they keep at it, then as Dave is celebrating 21 years today, basically, with us, it can be achieved and have a better quality of life that way.
Victoria, I noticed your reaction when David mentioned cryptocurrency, because as a regulator, again, you're going to go back a couple of decades, you have to worry about the horses and the pokies and a couple of other things. And now it has exploded. Online gambling in different forms, and now this whole cryptocurrency world where it is essentially quite often viewed as a gamble. I'll buy it at this and hopefully it'll go up to that, and then I'll sell it and I'll make all that back that I've lost on previous. So this brings about a whole nother scenario for you to have to think about.
Yes, it does, and it's quite concerning in terms of the, regulators talk about trying to keep ahead of the game, and these explosions of products that, quite frankly, we hardly even understand. And again, haven't we seen crypto just go through the roof, since COVID?
Yeah.
And why is that? Why are we seeing that in the community? And I understand that that's, it's right across. And the other thing to bear in mind with crypto is it's also linked to a lot of scams.
Yes.
So not only are people going to do their dough in terms of the choices, and I use that in inverted commas, that they make when they think that they're an informed investor, but they also run very serious risk of being scammed and losing a lot of money because, again, these things are they're so dark. I think that's certainly part of it. Can I just pick up on what Derek was talking
Please.
about too in terms of help seeking? And I think one of the things that is a real barrier to people seeking help is stigma. And I think there is a broader view in the community about gamblers. Why can't they just stop? They're just being selfish. They're just being greedy. They're just in it for the next big win. Can they just not sit in front of the poker machine? So we have these attitudes, I think, particularly about gamblers. And I think this makes it really, really difficult for people who want to seek help.
Yes.
The stigma is such a barrier and it's so harmful. So that's a really good conversation that we need to have as a community, and it's fantastic we're having this podcast. We've got Responsible Gambling Awareness Week coming up as well. And what is this about? It's about trying to break down this stigma. We've got our new advertising campaign, When Gambling Took Over, in which this gentleman here to my left, David, is one of our stars. And again, it's about humanising it. Like, this can happen to anybody. And these people look just like you. And how can we help them to get help? How can we not be judgmental? For all of those reasons that we've talked about before, whether it's nature, nurture, environment, new products, this can happen to anybody. And us being judgmental and stigmatising help seeking and gambling behaviour, we really need to change that conversation as a community.
And there's a campaign at the moment, I believe, which is running, perhaps an AFL player being asked exactly that question, well, why don't you just stop? And his answer, quite simply, is because I don't want to.
I didn't want to.
That's exactly right. And I would imagine, David, there was a point where you didn't want to stop. You perhaps knew, you probably got to a point where you knew that this wasn't healthy, but you were committed to it and you were continuing on with the behaviour. So then I would then ask, well, then how do we get to that point where we get them the help? Because the last thing we want to do is beat them over the head with a brick bat. How do we encourage family and friends to make that first initial contact and have that conversation where we don't just say, well, just stop doing it?
Oh, look, it's complex, is the simple response. To come back to Victoria's point there, I was here this morning when I got to Toowoomba and I was in a cafe, and the owner said, oh, why are you here today from Brisbane? And I said, I'm up here today to do a session about gambling and mental health. And he said, gamblers are just weak. And then someone else said, yeah, they should have more control. And then someone else, there was 4 people who had a very big misunderstanding, and I just smiled and I went, there's part of our great challenge, because for a gambler, there's terrible shame connected with it. And so to come back into some of those other points that we're talking about there, I think for family need to get help themselves, because, see, sometimes the family unit is only as healthy as its sickest member, and sometimes it's not the gambler who's the sickest in the family.
Yes.
All right. So sometimes, there's an actual other problem going on there, why the gambling solution started. And so sometimes the family member needs the greatest help, as well as the gambler too. And so it's such a complex story, and there's no easy solution to it, because gambling in this country is a normalised thing. When I go out and do an education session, I say, all right, hands up who had a bet on the Melbourne Cup before they were 18. Nearly every hand goes up.
Absolutely.
I said, hands up if you've had your name before you're 18 on a raffle ticket. Nearly every hand goes up. I said, who went with grandma or mum to a bingo session? Nearly, quite a few hands go up. I said, Who at the Ekka put a ping pong ball in a clown's mouth? Or bought 3 darts to try and hit a balloon? Or put a softball into a milk can? It's a normalised thing. And so I think when we talk about the stigma, the big thing is it's a normalised activity that someone wants to say, it's done me great harm. And in doing so, then it starts putting other people to start look at their own behaviour. And so it's easy. What's the best form of defence that anyone has? It is attack. And so, it's such a complex one, and that's why I get so much joy out of being a gambling help educator and going out in the community and changing the ideas that people have and challenging ideas and even assisting. Like I'm doing a lot of work currently with actually people who work in the industry to get them to understand what they're truly seeing in front of them. And they're amazed. I had a lady the other day who's been running the bingo for 18 years, and she said, now it makes sense why a person who wins the major prize at bingo doesn't get excited. I'm dealing with a problem gambler.
Yeah.
And I said, yeah.
And then that leads me to venues, the gambling providers, from a regulator's point of view. What role do they have in where we are at the moment with regard to gambling addiction and then the ongoing mental health of that, as opposed to they're running a business with a regulated but legal product?
And that's right. So first of all, there's a legal environment around it, and basically, there are laws in place that says, as a provider of gambling, you've got responsibilities. You have to make sure that you minimise the harm, because the reason that there's laws is because Parliament has recognised that this is a potentially harmful product. It's like, so we have to regulate it. So there's that level. There's a legal level. There's but then there's a human level. And I was at a club just a couple of weeks ago, actually, and what they said to me and what they're doing there is they see that their responsibility is not to take this as a matter of compliance, that they want to do this with their heart. This is a community-based club. It's a big club. And their message to me was, and we can still turn a profit. We can still actually have a very profitable business, but at the same time, we have at our heart and within our soul a culture of looking after our customers. And actually, that's been pretty good for our business because our customers actually see that we care for them. And this actually surprised me. They said that their staff feel more empowered. Because I think one of the things, if you're running particularly, a venue and you've got young staff walking the floor behind the bar, they see something, problem gambler, doing that intervention is really difficult. Who wants to be the person who goes up to somebody and taps them on the shoulder and says, hey, David, I think you got a problem. They're not listening to their family. They're not listening to their friends. How are they going to listen to a 20-year-old who they see once a week? So that's really hard. So venues who do best practice kind of build this into their business, and they have regular relationships with their customers. They know their people who are coming through the door. How are you, Mary? How's things going for you today? Trying to understand them as human beings so that when at times they have to have those conversations, they know who they are. They know their customers. I think that is so critical. We can have all these laws, and they are important, but good venues and the ones that we're seeing more and more and having these conversations, it's about a culture of care, and that doesn't necessarily have to compromise your business model. And having good relationships with your local gambling help providers, because at some point in time you're going to need the experts. You need to be able to refer people there. You're not counsellors. You're running a club or a pub or a wagering provider, whatever you're doing. But knowing who those experts are, getting them to come in and train your staff, building your capacity. And I think the RGAC that Derek chairs, what we're really seeing, and it's been very pleasing over the last 12 months, and seeing David out in the community as well, I think we're really seeing some really good work happening now between government, industry and community. None of us have the answer. It actually is going to take a whole team effort on this one.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. I'm sure that you would echo that, but it is that fine line, isn't it? Because we're talking about, again, a legal product that they are quite in their rights to market as a business, but at the same time, got to think about the ongoing effect of the product that they are marketing and to whom it might be causing harm. And that's a very difficult thing for anybody to have to deal with, particularly, perhaps a retailer, if you like, or a club or pub owner who finds himself in that scenario.
And I guess if I reflect back over the past 20 years, the RGAC has almost been operational about 20 years now. There's been some pretty solid discussions, as you can appreciate, between the community sector, the government sector, and industry around a whole range of topics. And and I remember around the Campbell-Newman time in particular, when the cutting of the red tape was on the table, and a lot of discussions about node acceptance limits for poker machines, and it's a fine line that's worked and walked when I think about it at the RGAC, because ultimately we're there for the consumer. The best outcome we can get for them in harm minimisation, where the code of conduct, the code of practice back in the year 2000 was developed, Lee, and it was about the theme then, and I know that Victoria as the Commissioner has continued to remind the RGAC at every opportunity, it is about harm minimisation and looking after the person who's going to access those gaming venues and looking after their well-being. I also, we talk, and I think, the catchphrase, obviously, gamble responsibly, that you hear often on ads and after there's been advertising done. For me, I think it better, as David has different captions as well. I prefer gamble sorry, I've lost my thought there. And moderation.
Yes.
Gamble in moderation is a far better way to go, that you moderate what you're gambling in regards that it fits your financial capacity at that point of time. But the RJC, can I just finish off and I'll hand back to you, that there's a number of challenges the RGAC's got at the moment as we work together, which really is it's a tripartite arrangement. If you look at it, industry, community and the government have continued to work together for the best outcomes. The rate of change that's facing the gaming industry at the moment, and again, Victoria touched on this, it's quite frightening in many ways, because the technology is moving so fast. And we've also recently been having some good discussion about a cashless society, how that's going to affect the gaming industry going forward. And it's probably not that far away. I think it's probably closer than we think at the moment. So there's a lot of work going on there, and it's an important cog. And just to finish off, we report upwards to the Attorney General from the RGAC, and I was pleased that she visited our meeting last week and joined us. So Minister Shannon Fentiman joined us, and we had heard from her. So I'll pass that back to you. But it's got an important role to play, and keeping pace with it, I think, is a challenge.
Yeah, no doubt about that. Wrapping things up, if we could perhaps go around and we just maybe give one final thought that you would like the audience to take from this podcast. They've heard us talking now for around an hour, and we have, I think, covered some fantastic ground, and hopefully we have given some thoughts to those people that might be listening, and give them cause to now have a real think about their behaviours and perhaps where they can go from here. So, David, a final thought that you would like people to take away?
Yeah, look, the final thought for me is that be a seed planter. Be a seed planter. That's what I'm doing when I'm doing education sessions. You and Lee, you and I can't be controlled in the midst of our madness. No one can control us. In fact, the more control you try and put on us, the more out of control we'll get. So be a seed planter. I say to people, I want to go up and say, I want to talk to you about your relationship with gambling. Well, what do you mean? I'm just concerned for you. and I care enough for you to say that I'm concerned about that. I don't have a problem. Okay, no worries. That's all right. I just wanted you to know that I was concerned for you. And be kind and being gentle to that person. Because it takes, on average, we go back to someone like Robert Custer, who did the earliest probably studies on gambling. And he said in the phases of gambling that he shows, from the winning phase to the desperation phase, it takes on average 22.7 years for someone to go from that winning phase to the I'm done. And I still think that's quite there. So I think more seed planting. And and I give this example. When I'm training in a venue, and I was doing some training where Victoria recently was at and having that discussion with that community club, when I do the training, I say, forget that you work in this industry. Hands up if you're concerned about a family member or a friend who has a poor relationship with gambling. And 50% of the hands went up. Yeah. And I said, I'm here today to teach you how to be a seed planter, because those people are going to come to your venue for you to see them gambling. They're going to go to someone else's. And so my hope is I get invited to that venue, so I get to teach them to be a seed planter. And so the more seed planting conversations we can have, hopefully the person who is like me goes, oh, I've changed venue again, or I've changed, my style of gambling. And even here they're saying, what's my relationship like with gambling? Maybe it's time for me to look at that. So I want us to be better seed planters in the community and be kind and be gentle, because a gambler in full flight is an ugly thing to see, well and truly. And, and if anyone is taking the time to listen to this point today, and if you have a poor relationship, you don't need to suffer anymore. To be a gambler in action is to suffer needlessly. I suffered too long. And I've been seed planting for many years now, and I'm seeing some of those seeds bear fruit. I understand that some of those seeds will never bear. There are some people who will just go on to the bitter end.
Yeah.
But I want us to be better in the community at having conversations, because we can't come up and say, Lee, you've got gambling is bad. People don't understand what goes inside of me. When I'm anticipating the gambling, there is no feeling better in this world.
Yeah.
You can't tell me that gambling is bad for me, because what it does for me is unreal. So let's be better seed planters in the community.
Oh, very well said. Victoria?
Well, where do you go from there? I mean, we as government, we stand on people like David, who's out there all day, every day, doing what he does, which is making a difference. I think the role that government can really play here is really about connecting. Yes. And what we're looking forward to, and I think the message I want people to take out of this, if there was a simple answer to this, we wouldn't have a problem. This is such a complex issue, and I think we've teased some of these things out today. As government, we really need to connect up with the community, with industry. We need to bring solutions at all levels. So it's about that cultural piece that we talked about, and you don't do that by one thing. There's going to be lots of different elements to that. One of the conversations I'm really having, and I know David is as well, with boards and how clubs and lifting the profile within people who make decisions about the way that businesses operate, and then they know when Mary comes in for the bingo what's going on for her. So it's a whole of community education. It's not just about educating gamblers and their families, it's everyone, and trying to break down those stigmas. I think given the world that we are facing, the complexity, the pace of change, we need to look to technology for solutions as well, because people are fallible, they're complex. We've talked about that a lot. So we really need to look to be designing safety into products as well. So I think the industry as well have a huge role and a great contribution that they can make in that space. As the regulator, keeping pace, getting the right regulatory settings in place. Derek talked before about cashless, and it is coming. Again, there's some things that concern us in terms of people's perception about how much money they're spending when they're not handing over notes and they're handing over a card. Yeah. But at the same time, there is an opportunity to build in controls, to build in pre-commitment, to build in verification, all sorts of things that I think if we're smart, we can get right at the front end by working with industry. And then the other piece that government and, the Queensland government invests about $7 million a year into the gambling help services is about that public health approach. It's not just about treating an individual, it's about the complexity of the issues that they might be facing and getting the good wraparound services around them to look at different facets of their life, not just about gambling, but how they can, do better with their family. What's their work like? How are their finances? And treat people, as we said, not as a homogenous group, but as individuals and value and care for them.
Derek?
I think for me it's I like to see normality come back into people's lives as much as possible. We do work in the area of community recovery, and that's often when things are out of control. There is help and support out there, and I will say, look, I had a brother who was a problem gambler. Raising the issues when you've got someone who is a problem gambler in your family takes a lot of courage and to work with them. And so I know people listening to this podcast, I will guarantee that they'll know someone who's struggling with their gambling habits at the moment. And I would encourage them to say, look, firstly, don't sit on your laurels, speak up, tell them that help's available, it's free, it's confidential, it's the Gambling Help Services in Queensland, spread right throughout the state. Get on the website, there's checklists in there, do your research and then reach out and make contact and help to bring some support to that family, your individual and the loved one.
Well, I think certainly something that you can take away from this podcast here today is that regardless of where you are on that journey and where your situation lies at the moment, you can now see the genuine face of the help and the compassion, and it's wonderful to see the face of the government regulation, that it is being done with compassion and with interest in genuine stories about where this has come from and then where we need to go, that it's not just about making popular political decisions. And if that doesn't bring you some heart for where you go next in the journey, then I'm not sure what else could. It's a wonderful forum that we've had here today. I thank our guests, Derek, David and Victoria. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you for listening and or watching. And the only thing I would encourage is that now, if you have taken something from this, encourage somebody else to see it. Encourage somebody else to listen to it. You know how to share these things. If you're not sure how to do it electronically, do it the old-fashioned way. Tap them on the shoulder and say, come and watch this, put these headphones on and have a listen to this, and it just might bring about some change in your family unit or in your life yourself. Again, thank you to our guests for your openness and your honesty here today. We very much appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.